So this topic is very close to our hearts and dear to us. So thank you very much for joining. With no further ado, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Creating a Legal Register in today's regulated business environment. And my name is Melanie Ramalho, and I am the Sales and Marketing Director of LexisNexis South Africa. And I am so excited to be here today. I will be your facilitator. Our session today will be looking at how to create an effective legal register. We will look at some of the pitfalls that organizations make when putting together a legal register, the importance of a dynamic legal register, and how technology can help us and can be used to enable us. Finally, we will equip you today with knowledge on how to create a legal register that is anchored by a risk matrix for your business. Why the interest in this subject from LexisNexis perspective, you might ask? Upholding governance, risk, and compliance is aligned with our purpose, which is to advance the rule of law. It's a subject near to my heart and dear to the organization's purpose and vision. The rule of law and good governance are essential and indivisible, although not sufficient alone to achieve sustainable development. As businesses, we have to be committed to advancing the rule of law, and it is not possible without compliance as the empowering, enabling force behind it. We know that advancing the rule of law is the right thing to do. It is good for business. And when done very well, it creates trust, customer loyalty, and affects the triple bottom line that we all are and have accountabilities and responsibilities to, which equals sustainability for the generations coming after us. The consequences when compliance fails are damning, starting from criminal charges to reputational woes and loss of lucrative opportunities. We know that the corporate graveyard is littered with examples of those that did not prioritize compliance. Yet upholding compliance as a business starts with the simple act of having it in place and having a legal register that is a summary of the legal obligations that applies to your organization. Simply listing the legislation is not enough. We all know, and today's session is all about building an effective legal register for your business. We are very pleased to have Steven Ndlovu, who is the founder and CEO of Kechani Advisory, a consultant firm that assists organizations with meeting their compliance objectives. Kechani Advisory is in the business of showing boards of organizations what their responsibilities are and how to ensure that they meet them when it comes to compliance. Steven Ndlovu is an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa with an LLM from the University of Pretoria, LLM Business Law from the University of KZN, and an MDP certificate, University of Stellenbosch Business School. He is a certified compliance practitioner from South Africa with a CPRAC SA. Wow, Steven, what all these achievements in, I don't know when you did it, and you still look like you just left school the other day. He's the founder and director of Kechani Advisory, an organization that offers public and private sector organizations accessible, affordable, and flexible compliance and legal advisory services. And before I hand over to our esteemed speaker, which I'm very excited to introduce today, just a bit about housekeeping for us. You can send your questions for our speakers using the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to those later in the program. Please reserve the chat box for general comments that are not questions. You specifically like or would like us to see or Steven to see our expert today. The webinar recording will be made available to all delegates a few days after this session today, and the slides will also be part of this recording. We will not send a separate deck. So Steven, welcome, and over to you.
Wow, Melanie, thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm so excited to engage with yourself, and I'm excited to engage with everybody who's joined us today. I see we have 73 participants, which is a very good turnout. So over the years, I think I've been spoiled in a sense that I've acquired so much experience in regulatory compliance, and I've had an opportunity to look at many legal registers. And I've always said to my colleagues at LexisNexis, I want an opportunity to share my knowledge, because I do understand that as compliance practitioners, compliance managers, check managers, etc., you might have only been confined to one organization or maybe two organizations. So you wouldn't necessarily have had an opportunity to view many legal registers from many different companies and different industries, etc. So just to give you a little bit of background, I've looked at legal registers from the public sector, from an occupational health and safety perspective, from an environmental perspective. I've also looked at legal registers from the private sector, and as well that related to occupational health and safety, environmental legislation in the South African context, in the Mozambican context, in the Namibian context as well. And I can say to you with confidence that over the years, I've seen some common threads with regard to legal registers and some of the pitfalls that relate to legal registers. So in this session today, I want to share with you my knowledge, and I welcome any questions that you have, because I want this session to be, I want it to be informative, but I also want it to be collaborative in the way it's presented and in the way you ask your questions and in the way I respond to those questions. And I'm also very excited to participate in a webinar where we're talking about something that affects us all, regardless of the industry that you participate in, regardless of the size of your organization. A legal register is something that you should have in place already. But if you don't have it in place as of now, then it's not the end of the world. You still have an opportunity to put that in place. And obviously you would have had the benefit of this session. So without wasting any more time, this is a question that, in my opinion, is not asked often enough. And that question is, what is the purpose of a legal register? This question is very important, because when you ask this question, then you're forced to come up with answers. And I believe that the answers to the question of what is the purpose of a legal register, it's packed with lots of wisdom that can help you to improve your existing legal register. So ladies and gentlemen, if you want to improve your legal register and you want to improve any other aspects of your governance, risk, and compliance, you always need to ask yourself the question, what is the purpose of what I'm doing? For example, what is the purpose of a legal register? And then, ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to get the elephant out the room, in a sense that some organizations will refer to a legal register. Some organizations will refer to a regulatory universe, compliance universe, and that's fine. So those documents are not necessarily the same, but the outcomes which those documents seek to achieve are, in my view, the same. So what a compliance universe seeks to achieve is the same as what a legal register seeks to achieve. So let's not mind the fact that maybe in your organization, you're referring to a compliance universe, yet on this platform, we're referring to a legal register. I think ultimately, we're trying to all map our compliance obligations and our compliance risks, regardless of the specific terminology that we're using. Ladies and gentlemen, we all need to agree that if you correctly use a legal register, then there's an opportunity to correctly identify your compliance obligations. And then within those compliance obligations, there's an opportunity to identify your compliance risks. So once you identify your compliance obligations and you also identify your compliance risks, then what you should have is a compliance risk profile. Now, in my experience, most legal registers have a tendency of just outlining a very expansive list of legislation and bylaws and regulations. I'm just thinking of the legal registers that I'm currently looking at, both in the public and the private sector. And all you see is pages and pages of legislation. You see, the problem with that is, fine, you might identify the legislation that applies to your organization, but then you're left with an incomplete job, because you still, within the context of that legislation, you still need to identify the specific compliance obligations. For example, in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, it's fine to identify it, but what about Section 8 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which specifically deals with the obligation of every employer to conduct a risk assessment? So you see, you might have identified Occupational Health and Safety Act, which applies to organization, but now, because you haven't gone a step further to identify your compliance risk, you've now not done that compliance risk assessment that's referred to in Section 8. And in COVID times, it's a legal obligation for you to identify your compliance risks within the working environment. Just the other day, I saw an official from the Department of Labor walk into a store, and he said he's from the Department of Labor and he's here to do an assessment in terms of COVID regulation and occupational health and safety regulations. So that just goes to show you how practical the issue of a legal register is, and the issue of identifying compliance obligation and your compliance risks. And then interestingly, that official from the Department of Labor, he put a form on the table and he said, look, I want this form completed and I'll be back in the next hour. Those are literally his words. So if that organization doesn't have any COVID related measures and they can't articulate those measures and they can't unpack what they've done from a risk assessment perspective, then there might be some trouble from that Department of Labor inspector. Ladies and gentlemen, also it's quite unfortunate that many legal registers are almost used as a tick box exercise. And I refer to the statement that I just made. Most of the legal registers that I look at are just a list of legislation, but there's no unpacking of the compliance obligations, etc., which leads one to believe that this is just a tick box exercise. So obviously the problem with the tick box exercise is that you've got an exercise which is incomplete, which is not useful, and most importantly, you've got a legal register which is ineffective. So obviously, attendees, today I want you to take in what I have to say so that you can avoid a situation where you've got a document that doesn't really mean anything and a document that's not effective. So good legal registers, ladies and gentlemen, must be developed in the context of an organization's overall risk management. There's a tendency to assume that a legal register belongs or is independent from the whole organization. But of course it's not. A legal register is one of the mechanisms in place for an organization to risk manage effectively. So when you look at a legal register, remember that that's part of the armory of your whole organization's risk management efforts. Another thing, ladies and gentlemen, if you've got a legal register in place, surely you need to have some kind of a methodology that supports that legal register. And I've heard some boards ask the question when they look at, for example, a legal register, they ask the question, what is the methodology that informs this legal register? And in most cases, we're unable to answer that question, which is wrong, which means we haven't given enough thought to the legal register. So what do I mean by a methodology that underlines your legal register? Your legal register, at the end of the day, it needs to be subjected to monitoring, and there also needs to be a process whereby the instances of non-compliance with compliance obligations that are listed on your legal register, those instances of non-compliance need to be reported to senior management, to EXCO, and they need to be reported to the board. But most importantly, those instances of non-compliance need to be addressed so that ultimately they can be closed out. So again, if you've just got a long list of legislation and there's no methodology around monitoring of those compliance obligations, reporting on non-compliance, closing out instances of non-compliance, then that whole exercise is not effective and it doesn't operate as intended. That document needs to result in empirical evidence with regard to an organization's current compliance status with the legislation that applies to it. I've spoken about compliance monitoring. Now, about 2 years ago, I looked at a legal register in the context of a port environment. So you'd be looking at occupational health and safety, COIDA, labor relations, etc. That legal register was, I kid you not, 1,095 pages. That's 1,095 pages. Now you ask yourself, if a legal register is 1,095 pages, how do you go about monitoring that legal register? And who would be responsible for monitoring that legislation? And how long would it take them to monitor that legislation? Would you have to outsource the work as an organization? Would you have a team internally that's big enough to monitor those compliance obligations? So that just shows that if you've got a legal register that's not created the way it should be, then it creates a problem for everybody. It creates a problem for those who are responsible for monitoring and reporting. And then it also creates a problem for your board structures, because ultimately they can't account to what the organization is supposed to comply with. And most importantly, they don't have an answer with regard to, are we compliant, yes or no? They don't have that answer because the document that was developed is not assisting them in carrying out their work as a board. So it's very important that that legal register, it's something that compliance officers can work on. If you're a SHEC manager, it's something that you can use as well. And it's something that you can report on so that the whole organization can be protected from the perspective of identifying compliance obligations and ensuring that they're properly addressed. There's more questions to be asked. So if your legal register is 1,000 pages long, or not even 1,000 pages long, but it's very lengthy, you need to ask yourself these questions. How is the legal register monitored and compliance therewith monitored? Who monitors compliance with the legal register? Is it the SHEC manager? Is it the legal department, compliance department? Is it management? Also, how regularly is that legal register monitored? Is it once a quarter? Is it once per annum? You need to have that answer. And then number 4, is the board accurately kept abreast of and advised on instances of non-compliance? Then, ladies and gentlemen, if there's one of these questions that you can't answer, in other words, questions 1 to 4, then there's a fundamental problem with regard to your legal register and the overall thinking around your legal register. And that's something that you need to address, spend some time on. I mentioned the issue of your organization's overall risk management initiatives. So a legal register must reduce an organization's legal compliance risk. And if it can't do that, then, and in fact, if it can't do that in a measurable fashion, in other words, in a fashion that allows you to report, then it's ineffective. And we all need to avoid that word ineffective when we're talking about our legal registers. And then beyond being able to mitigate legal compliance risks, a legal register should also place an organization in a position to identify various market opportunities. Now this is very interesting, because in the context of COVID, we all know that in terms of the disaster management regulations, certain industries were able to carry on trading throughout the various levels of lockdown. And then obviously, if you didn't fall within the categories of those industries, you couldn't trade. But here's the thing, if you had a very good understanding of the Disaster Management Act and the regulations there to pass from time to time, then you could have strategized in such a way that your operations are minimally affected. For example, I know of some logistics operations that throughout all the levels of lockdown, they were able to operate, but within the confines of the law. And they were able to operate because they understood the disaster management regulations. In contrast, I know some companies that their operations were significantly affected, but the reason why their operations were significantly affected is that they didn't take the time to understand the disaster management regulations. So obviously now they can't go back and cure that wrong. So they would have reported significant revenue loss, and shareholders would have been unhappy, etc. And that was avoidable if only there was more time spent on the disaster management regulations and unpacking that in a way that makes sense to the business and the business's operations. Also, ladies and gentlemen, it's a reality that in some industries, if you don't have certification, then you can't operate. For example, in the petrol logistics industry, you need certain certifications and verifications. And if you don't have those, then you can't operate, for example, a fuel tanker because you don't have the certification. So what happens is that the organizations that are able to get these certificates in place, they can operate and they can benefit from operating within the confines of the law. Another very good example is POPI non-compliance. And now I'm not sure whether POPI is something that you would include in your legal registers, because remember, legal registers differ. Some legal registers, they focus on occupational health and safety, so SHEC-related issues. Some legal registers will focus on environmental legislation. And then some legal registers will try to outline all the legislation that applies to organization. POPI is an interesting example because regardless of what industry you're operating in, POPI is directly relevant to your organization. And POPI is a nice example because if you look at POPI, the legislation, and then you look at the compliance obligations within that legislation, you'll see that those compliance obligations, they don't apply to all organizations. For example, if you look at section 69, which deals with direct marketing, some organizations, direct marketing is simply not part of their business model. And then you'll find with marketing agencies, as an example, that they do a lot of direct marketing. So therein lies the importance of being able to identify the legislation, but also the specific compliance obligations that apply to your business and your operations. So ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with the question, do you have a legal register? And ladies and gentlemen, if your answer is no, it's not the end of the world because we're having this discussion. You still have an opportunity to develop that legal register. In fact, I would rather you embark on the journey of creating that legal register now and doing it properly than being like some of the organizations that I've worked with who find they've got legal registers, but unfortunately, their legal registers don't mean much because they've just captured a whole list of legislation. So ask yourself the question, do you have the legal register, and see what you can do about it. And then you must remember that if you don't have a legal register and you don't embark on the journey of identifying compliance obligations, compliance risks, then you do two things. You deprive your organization of the opportunity to identify as compliance risks and manage those risks accordingly. But also, we all know that in terms of King 4, we don't only talk about risk, we talk about risk and we talk about opportunity. So if you don't have a legal register, then you're also depriving your organization of the opportunity to identify opportunities within the regulatory landscape. Just one more example that talks to the element of opportunity in the regulatory landscape. If you look at data privacy law in general, you don't even have to limit it to POPI. If you look at data privacy law in general, in terms of POPI, in terms of the GDPR, you'll see that there's conglomerates in the global context that had actually created a competitive advantage around being able to adequately protect your personal information. For example, Apple has gone on a whole drive to say that we're an organization who can protect your information through our devices. And a couple of months ago, there was a new software update where if you want to ensure that no website can track you and your activity, then there's an option that you can select. And that means whenever you browsing through the web, then nobody can trace you and no one can have your customer behavior, so to speak. So to some consumers, that's quite an attractive value proposition. So it goes to show, if you understand the data privacy landscape within the context of POPI and the GDPR, then you could create yourself a competitive advantage. And the reverse is true. If you don't comply with POPI, for example, then that could affect your reputation. And I always say that the unfortunate thing about having a reputation that's adversely affected is that you don't know what that costs. So with a fine is a quantifiable amount. It's 5 million, it's 10 million, it's at least you know what you're in for. But with reputational loss, you don't know what the quantum is. And worst of all, you don't know how long, if ever, you'll be able to get that reputation back. So it's very important that we guard our reputations through our legal registers and the effectiveness of our legal registers, and ensuring that we're always operating within the confines of the law. So ladies and gentlemen, over the years, I've been very fortunate to be working close with LexisNexis, who've been able to guide me on working more efficiently whenever I encounter legal registers, and work in a way where I've got a system that outlines the legislation for me, but they can also help me identify my compliance risks, but most importantly, help me to have some form of a dashboard that will say, okay, look, in terms of this legislation, these are the things that you're supposed to be doing as an organization, and these are the actors within your organization who are actually responsible for those compliance obligations. So ladies and gentlemen, without eating into time any further, I'd like to introduce my favorite colleague, Vuyokazi Sithole, who will take you through the platform solution showcase. And I'm sure that she'll be able to give you some ideas on how you can deal with some of the conundrums that I've mentioned in terms of legal registers. Vuyo, I hand over to you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our Legal Register webinar platform. Just to start where Stephen finished off, once you have all of this in place, what then happens? Once you have a legal register, what then happens? If you have an existing one, how do you then manage it? How do you ensure that you comply? And as LexisNexis, we have all the tools in place to assist you in ensuring that you comply. We have our Lexis GRC legal register module, as well as the audit manager module, which I will take you through very quickly, just to give you an overview and just to entice you on what is currently in the market to assist you automate and ensure compliance throughout. I'll ask Stephen to stop sharing so I can also share my screen. Stephen. Okay. Perfect. All right. And I'll just jump straight into it. So our Lexis GRC is a modular platform. It offers various modules, and you can pick and choose the modules that are most relevant to you at that specific time. And right now the discussion is around legal register. Once you have a legal register in place, how do you then go about ensuring that you comply and you avoid penalties that may be detrimental to your business? So what we would then do, we would offer you our library platform. This is where your content would sit. So your legal register, Stephen has put this into context for you, and you have this in place. So then LexisNexis comes in and provides you with the legislation, the different acts that would sit within your legal register. So we would provide, and they would sit within your library. And I'll just use the Occupational Health and Safety Act as an example of how it would then look like. Okay, it's just loading. So we would provide you with the act, the rules and regulations, as well as the wording of sections. What we've further done is that we've taken the act and broken it down to the different sections. Stephen went into this in terms of you might be asked to comply within a particular section. You might have to have risk management in place. So this helps you drill down into all those aspects and get a great overview of that. Okay, so I'll use section.
Please could we ask you to reshare your screen? We're not seeing it at the moment. Thank you.
All right. Okay, let me just do this. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet, Vuyo.
Can you see it now?
Coming up, it's coming up. There we go. How we can.
Okay, so I'll just go back just a bit so that you have a full view of what I was speaking about. So we would provide the act, the rules and regulations, and wording of section. So when you go into the act, we've broken it down to different sections of the act. So when we look at, for example, section 17, what we then do, we provide you with the verbatim, the plain language. So verbatim would be word for word of what the section says. We provide you with the plain language. This is not an interpretation of verbatim, but it's layman's terms. So if you don't have a legal background, you have a very clear understanding of what the verbatim means. And this we do provide for some pieces of legislation, but in pieces of legislation that we don't provide this, you can add your own plain language. So this is an interpretation or understanding of what the verbatim is for your business. Okay, we further provide you with the penalty, so you don't have to scroll down throughout the whole act. We will give you what the penalty is for that particular section. In this instance, it would be a fine not exceeding 50,000 or imprisonment not exceeding a year. So it's quite crucial. And then we provide you with related content tab. This is where you can attach any documentation. So be it minutes that you've discussed about this particular section, be it permits that are required for this particular section. So you have a nice central repository of all documentation. Okay, we further provide you with a remarks tab, so you can add remarks, any text that is related to this particular section. So you provide the section context in ensuring full compliance. We further have a risk tab. This allows you to identify risks as and when you go through a particular section. So this will nicely link into your risk module, which is another module that we offer, and you now start to build that risk register. So section 8 does say that you have to have risk management in place, and the solution does exactly that. It integrates and provides you a great workflow to have in place in ensuring you comply. So just a quick recap. Gajeni Advisory has provided you with your legal register. You have that in place. We've now provided you a nice library in where all your content or legislation would sit. We further ensure that your content is updated. So any updates with any piece of legislation that sits within your library will queue here. So you will easily update that and always be working on the most relevant piece of legislation. Okay. We now further allow you to then manage your legal register. So I'll just provide you with a quick overview on how you go about managing your legal register. So you'd provide us with your organogram, your different business units within your organization, be it HR, finance. What you would then do, you'd click maybe on the HR department and you'd go onto your library and click on all the different pieces of legislation that speak to your HR department. So basic conditions of employment, the Labor Act, so that you nicely manage it based on the different business units. So you can update your register, you can delete, you can create or overwrite your register, and it's a beautiful platform in which you would then manage your legal register. Further, with managing your legal register, we allow you to then perform audits on your particular legislation that sits within your legal register. So we have a step-by-step guide in which you would start an audit from beginning till end, and we'll break it down and provide you with all obligation questions. So any checklist questions that you need to respond to ensure compliance. So once that is done, all you do, you click a button and you would download a nice partial or full compliance report, which is your legal audit report that you can present to the board and you can use to enhance your business and use it to measure competitive advantage and to ensure full compliance within your organization. Okay, so that's my time for now, but if you have any further questions, please list them below. If you want to interact with me more, please feel free to leave your details and I'll contact you and we can take some time to go through the system thoroughly and ensure your compliance needs are met. Thank you. Over to you, Mal.
Thank you, Vuyo and Steven. What an insightful integration of showing us what a legal register is all about, how important it is for us to keep in our organization. I do have a few questions for both Vuyo and for Steven. Thank you, everybody, for the questions posted. One of the questions, Steven, is, for a one-man business, is it still important to have a legal register?
Thank you, Melanie. Absolutely. Let me give you an example. Income Tax Act, VAT, Value Added Tax Act. For even a one-man business, you've got to comply with income tax legislation. But if you've not identified Income Tax Act as something that applies to you, then the question is, how will you be able to comply with it? Because you haven't identified it, and you haven't identified the specific compliance risks that are within that legislation. And then when it comes to this time of the year, when you're supposed to do your PAYE returns, etc., then you're probably going to hit non-compliance because you weren't aware of what the Income Tax Act expects of you. And if you look at the Value Added Tax Act, which is something that could easily apply to a one-man business, I think it's second month, you're expected to do your VAT returns. And there's usually sums of money that you're owing to SARS. And if you don't pay those monies every second month, then not only do you continue to owe those monies, but they accumulate interest on a monthly basis. So absolutely, regardless of your size, you need to, at the very least, if you're a one-man show, you need to identify what is the legislation that you need to comply with to ensure that you can continue operating within the confines of the law. And just one more point, if you're a one-man business and you participate in tenders, for example, then you're expected to be tax compliant, you're expected to have a CSD, you're expected to have a BBBE affidavit, which is in terms of the BBBE Act, and you might even be expected to be COIDA compliant, especially if you're doing work for the likes of Transnet and Eskom, where you're going to be doing some site work. So absolutely, you've got to ensure that you identify what applies to you. But thank you for that question. It's a very good question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. And then I do have another question, Gloria. Maybe you just need to put a little bit more description here, but Gloria was asking while you were presenting this question, it actually came through. In this scenario, what will be the legal register for SARS? I hope that makes sense for you. You're on mute, Stephen.
My apologies. In the context of SARS, you must remember SARS is a creature of statute. So they're not exempt from complying with the legislation. In fact, you might have seen a couple of weeks ago, SARS published a RFQ for assistance on POPI compliance, which tells you that SARS in their legal register has identified the Protection of Personal Information Act as being a compliance risk that they have and that they've not mitigated. And obviously now they want a service provider to help them comply with POPI. SARS would also have to comply with employment equity legislation, COIDA legislation, labor relations, occupational health and safety, etc. So they're no different. The only thing different about them is the nature of operation. So their work is mainly office-based. So they'll have to comply with office-based legislation. I hope that answers it.
Yes, I'm sure, Gloria, if you want more, please tell us, because that was a specific question there from Gloria. Well, Vuyo, we need to see your beautiful face. I have one for you. Would the library be automatically updated if there's any updates to legislation and or penalties, etc.? You on mute, our 2020 and 21 favorite say.
Sorry about that. Yes, it would definitely be updated. So I'll use an example for if there's an amendment of the occupational health and safety. As soon as that is effective, you will get a queue updates that this has been amended, and you would easily update it and work on the most updated version of the occupational health and safety.
And I do recall you have a Lexis Assure that gives you latest updates and alerts you as well. Okay.
Yes, so the beauty of our solution, like I mentioned, it is modular based. So you can add the Lexis Assure module to it. So the Lexis Assure module will give you alerts to any regulations that speak to your industry. So if it's, let's say, retail industry or mining industry, it will effectively give you any alerts that sit within, let's say, your legal register. So all acts that sit within your legal register, you will get alerts on those of any changes or amendments done to them.
Excellent. Thank you, Vuyo. Another one for you. What type of reports will be available for the risk register from the Lexis GRC solution?
Okay, so I'd actually like to take that that particular individual through the system so we can go through the different reports that you can actually access. So I wanted to entice you. Okay, so can actually access quite a couple of reports, one being a legal audit report where you just click a button and get you all the results that you had responded to in terms of compliance. So it would be a Word or PDF document. We further give you reports in terms of a dashboard. So we do have an interactive dashboard, which will give you full view of all the risks that you've identified in your business, be it CRM reports. It'll give you an indication of your top 10 risks within your business. It gives you a nice full scope of all the different risks pertaining to different locations of your organization, so per business unit, so high risk within HR, high risk within the finance department. But leave your details and I'll definitely give you a call to take you through all of that.
Excellent. Thank you, Vuyo. And just before we go on to some more questions, we do have a poll that while we are going through the questions that will pop up on your screen, please do take a few seconds to complete this for us, as it is extremely helpful to help us in crafting and delivering content that you all find useful and relevant. It's been absolutely amazing being part of this session with you. You'll see that the poll will come up, and while we're answering the questions, please do take a few seconds to answer that. Another question, this one is, again, Vuyo or Steven. Hi, I think it was for Vuyo. Please share a sample of compliance audit report one can use in presenting to the board or exco. And I think I know what Vuyo is going to answer, but I'll let her answer this one for you.
I'll contact you. You can give me your and I'll take you through the system. The beauty of our reports is that we can tailor make them to suit your environment. So we can actually even add your logo. So I can't give you a sample because it would be specific to your requirements. So in our call, in our session, I'll take you through all of that and we can discuss it even further.
And then we do have another one. Yolanda said you must please contact her to do a presentation for Vuyo.
Definitely.
We will do so, Yolanda. It's an absolute pleasure for us to do that. And the webinar is recorded that we will send to you just a few days after this one. Another one, Vuyo, is there any restrictions on the number of acts you can add to the register? Or Steven, actually, let Steven answer that one for us. Shall I say it again? It was, yes. Is there any restrictions on the number of acts you can add to the legal register, Steven?
Okay, thank you, Melanie. So definitely there's no limit on the number of legislation you can add to your register. Remember, as I said, in terms of the webinar, is you need to identify the legislation that is material to your organization. So in terms of the generally accepted compliance practice framework, there's a principle called prioritization. So what that means is you must prioritize the legislation that your organization must comply with.
Absolutely. I've got one for both of you, Vuyo and Steven. Would LexisNexis assist an organization in putting together a legal register? And the partnership between LexisNexis and Tani is that we can do it together and help you put that together for sure. Give us your details. I do see your name and we will get in contact with you just to answer that. And then another one, Vuyo, asking what would be the ballpark costs? And I'm tempted to answer, but I'll let you answer, just giving some indication, but it all depends, as you know, on so many variables in that. So just over to you on that one, Vuyo.
It does depend. So it depends on the number of pieces of legislation that sit within your legal register. So we would price you per act. So you're looking at starting from 5,000 Rand per act, which will include obligation questions and as well as the system going on to provide you with reports. And then the Lexis GRC system on its own with the legal module, as well as the audit manager module, you're looking at roughly 150,000 or 100,000. So altogether, it would start from 150,000. But it's a discussion we can have within our session and see how we can then provide this for you, because we have different options of you paying it per month or per debit order. We have different, we're very open to discussions on how to ensure that you comply while meeting your pocket compliance.
Absolutely. One more question, Vuyo. Can the system apply different jurisdictions, like, for example, including Lesotho?
Yes, it can. So the dashboards are amazing, and I will show you within our sessions across the board. We have a nice heat map that can provide you full view of what's happening in your organization across the board, especially if you have presence in more than one country. So if you have a presence in Lesotho, we do offer legislation from Lesotho. We're slowly developing legislation for Lesotho, but we would provide you with the system and you'd be able to automate that whole process. So we do also have a legislation from other African countries like Nigeria. Obviously the list just left my mind now, but it's quite more than 10 countries. We have a presence in more than 10 countries, and we'd be able to
Rwanda,
yes, Malawi, Angola, Eswatini. Yes, so we do have a presence in those countries as well.
Namibia, Swaziland, everywhere.
Namibia, yes.
Thank you, Vuyo. One more question for, I think, both you and Steven to maybe have an answer to this is, would you have a register with all the compliance requirements from the various acts in one register? For example, some institutions have about 70 acts that are applicable to them. And what's the best way to go about achieving this? So maybe Steven first, and then Vuyo, you can talk from a platform solution perspective. Thanks, Steven.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you for the question. So when it comes to a multitude of legislation, for example, 70, what you'll need to decide is whether working through an Excel spreadsheet, for example. I mean, we've done legal registers where you had several pieces of legislation, and then we actually, on an Excel spreadsheet, we divided the legislation into environmental and occupational health and safety, and then organization-wide, etc. And you're able to capture all the legislation and all the compliance obligations. But then again, it's important that you identify the most important legislation. So you prioritize. If you're prioritizing legislation, you shouldn't really end up with 70 pieces of legislation that you're looking at in your register. For me, the number 70 suggests that there's work to be done in making that legal register more efficient and rooting out legislation that's not that important to your organization. So in other words, it's sort of secondary legislation. It's not primary. So you need to just do that distinction and that homework. What is primary legislation that if we don't comply with, then you can't operate, and then do a separate exercise to identify the secondary legislation where it's not a case of if we don't comply, we can't operate, but maybe we will be affected in a reputational sense. Yes. So do that exercise, but very good question.
Excellent.
Yes, indeed, Steven. So further to that, once you've prioritized the legislation that is important to you, so maybe cutting that 70 to maybe your top 20 most top high risk pieces of legislation, then those would be the 20 pieces of legislation you would then add on to the Lexis GRC solution to then manage and begin doing compliance. And once you attain full compliance on that and you're happy with that, you're quite happy with the compliance and the way that you are managing those pieces of legislation, you go on to your medium high risk and then your low high risk. And then from there on, you would find that you've covered all 70 pieces of legislation and managed it accordingly. And then it's just a follow-up thereafter.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that insightful question. Vuyo, another one to you. It looks like our solution is a web application. Where is the data center? Those are two questions. Is it a web application, and where is the data center of the solution?
Okay, so our solution is hosted on the cloud. I would then provide you with the technical details, which will give you all the information around security detail and to ensure that your information is safe. It is hosted on the cloud, but you do have the option of hosting it on premise, so on your server. So it just depends on your IT safety requirements, but we do have the option for both. So don't worry about that. We got you covered.
Excellent. Then I've got a question specific. Ria is saying, I have the jury data property laws and prefer to work with a hard copy. Is there a service available to update my binders on a regular basis? Vuyo?
Okay, so in terms of having a service that updates your binders on a regular, I think we did away with that service, Melanie, because of the way that everything is transitioning to online. However, if we have a discussion, if maybe I have a one-on-one discussion with you, we can find a way on how we could find a solution for you. So let me get in touch with you and then find a way in which I could assist you get that sorted for you.
So yes, LexisNexis does do loose leaves, but
yes,
of course,
we do.
Publications, but we just want to for this one.
I just want to get a full understanding that do you want us as LexisNexis to update that for you, or would you then go on to purchase the most recently updated loose leaf? But we can have that discussion and I can assist you with that.
Thank you. I have somebody else asking a question both to Steven and Vuyo. Can you share any case studies and reference sites? Steven, will you first?
Yes, Steven.
Vuyo is saying yes, Steven.
Sorry, what's the question, Melanie? I didn't get that. I just heard case study.
Can you share any case studies and reference sites?
Case studies and reference sites.
We would be able to, I know.
Yes, we would. I have a lot of case studies with a lot of clients that I've interacted with that I can share some of their perspective and how they then went about going the whole legal register, getting an audit manager module, and getting the whole Lexis GRC system onto their organization. I can share that with you, and I can easily discuss how we could then manage your unique requirements for governance, risk, and compliance.
Excellent.
Okay, Melanie, sorry, I only just understood. I'll gladly send all the references that I have. I don't mind. That's fine.
Fantastic.
From a legal register perspective, from a compliance management perspective, etc., I'll gladly send those. No problem.
Okay, fantastic. One last question, I think, and then we've dealt with everything. We've got one more minute. Vuyo, this one is for you again. Is your risk rating methodology adaptable to use the organization's ratings?
Yes. So the standard system comes with a 5x5 risk matrix. But if you have your own internal risk matrix that you use, so some organization would use maybe a 5x6, we would take that and integrate it onto the system to then allow you to be able to perform risk management or risk assessments according to you and your objectives.
Great, thank you. Terry, yes, we will make the case studies and references available to everybody, as Steven and Vuyo will share some with us on this topic today, and we will get our organizer to email it to everybody with the recording that we will be sending out with the webinar. And that one last question, Vuyo, you are a busy lady this afternoon. Can you also add company policies and standards to the register or only legislation?
Yes, you can. So the beauty of the solution, when I showcase the library, you can add your own internal policies, you can add bylaws, you can add any different instrument that speaks to your environment, and then the workflow will just be easily added onto the system. So you can go on to even do audits on your own internal policies to ensure that you comply with your own internal policies.
Okay. Melanie, can I just jump in there for a second, if you don't mind?
Sure.
That's a very nice question. Remember, policies are part of your risk management. So to comply legislation, let's use the example of POPI again. To comply with POPI, you have to comply with the legislation itself, but then you need some policy guidance as well to assist everyone in the organization understand what their compliance obligations are. Remember, when it comes to POPI, even if someone very junior in your organization violates a data subject's personal information, a data subject can still go to court on that basis because of the strict liability rules. So what you want to do to circumvent non-compliance at any level of the organization is to develop an appropriate POPI policy that's circulated throughout the organization. And then you also give internal audit an opportunity to audit the organization against the policy.
Excellent. With that, with no further ado, I see people are rushing to their next meeting. Thank you so much, Rio and Steven, for that wonderful presentation and showing how the platform from a solutions perspective can work and enable us around meeting our compliance duties around a legal register. So thank you. Thank you so much for taking time, and have a wonderful Tuesday afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.